Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. It's time for Album Wars Part 2. I'll be choosing between rock and metal records nominated in matchups by you guys. First off, thank you to everybody who submitted these matchups over in the community tab. I obviously couldn't get to all of you in the part 1 that I did, so tried to get to some of you guys that I might have missed in this part 2 video here, getting started with this great Black Sabbath matchup. The first two albums of the Dio era of Sabbath. Of course, I'm talking about Heaven and Hell versus Mob Rules. Love both of these records, and after Sabbath reinvented themselves with Ronnie on lead vocals and had the ability to, take more chances in the studio, they essentially made the same record twice, right? They followed up Heaven and Hell with a very similar album in Mob Rules, but if it's not broken, don't fix it. That's, my attitude as far as it's concerned here, so I don't mind the fact that the two albums are very similar, they're very comparable, and so that makes for a really interesting matchup here. Heaven and Hell features Bill Ward on the drums. He wouldn't play again on a Sabbath record until Born Again a few years later, and then by Mob Rules, he had Vinny Appice in the band, and, I love Vinny's drumming with Sabbath, and then Dio solo catalog as well. Bill's drumming on Heaven and Hell, I think, is very tight, but it's uninspired compared to his past work with the band. He seemed pretty checked out around that point, and both records are full of amazing Tony Iommi guitar riffs, and Dio's vocals added a whole new dimension to the Sabbath sound. These are two phenomenal and very evenly matched records as far as I'm concerned, and standouts on Heaven and Hell include, of course, the great title track, right? Also, you have Die Young, Children of the Sea, Neon Nights, Lady Evil, Lonely is the Word is fantastic, and then on Mob Rules, you have some other fantastic tracks on here. Standouts like Turn Up the Night, Voodoo, The Sign of the Southern Cross, Mob Rules, Country Girl, Falling Off the Edge of the World over and over, so great records here, but ultimately I think Heaven and Hell is just a little bit stronger. Now, Mob Rules may have higher highs, but Heaven and Hell is just a more consistent record. Next, it's a battle of two classic Judas Priest albums here as Defenders of the Faith takes on Screaming for Vengeance. Priest were on a roll by this point, doing some of the best and most consistent work of their careers, and both of these records are pretty similar, kind of like what I was talking about with Sabbath. Everything was working, the vibes were good, and the band was on fire, so why change anything, right? Defenders of the Faith has a better side 1, in my opinion, but Screaming has the better side 2. However, if you ask me again tomorrow, I might give you a different answer. I'd be totally flipped, but ultimately here today, I'm going to give the advantage here to Defenders of the Faith, just by a hair. Both records are extremely comparable, but with tracks like Free Wheel Burning, Jawbreaker, The Sentinel, Love Bites, some heads are going to roll. I have to give the slight edge here to Defenders of the Faith, but I also love some of the deep cuts on Defenders as well. Songs like Eat Me Alive, Night Comes Down, Heavy Duty, some really awesome songs here. Rock Hard, Ride Free, but, I prefer those over some of the more forgotten tracks on Screaming for Vengeance, songs like, Riding on the Wind, Take These Chains, Pain and Pleasure, right, Fever. So, all in all, two fantastic records, two absolute Priest essentials, and at the end of the day, it's such a close call. When I ranked the Judas Priest catalog, it was one of the hardest rankings I ever had to do on the channel because, the order changes all the time when you get to the top shelf stuff, including these two records. Love this next matchup here. We're going to stick with Judas Priest and go with Painkiller, taking on Fight and their debut record, A War of Words. Fight, of course, Rob Halford's post-Priest solo project. Two very heavy records here, and Painkiller, of course, was the much-needed return to a more aggressive sound, heavier, especially compared to the more commercial releases with Turbo and Ram It Down. And what I love about this matchup is that War of Words by Fight really does feel like a continuation of the Painkiller sound, and what a 90s Judas Priest could have sounded like had Rob Halford remained in the band. And these are two records that were released, in my opinion, during Rob Halford's vocal peak, and I'd say War of Words is the more aggressive album, especially lyrically. It's a pretty angry record, and definitely something that Rob had to get out of his system, and as much as I love it, as much as I love tracks on here like Into the Pit, Nailed to the Gun, Life in Black, Immortal Sin, Laid to Rest, it's going up against Painkiller, one of the greatest metal albums of all time, and it's hard not to choose Painkiller, and, the double axe attack here of Glenn Tipton and KK Downing, I'm really unleashing on guitar, I'd say, after two more restrained records with Turbo and Ram It Down, but you have the great drumming on here by Scott Travis as well on his Priest debut with that iconic drum intro to the title track, and I think that these are both statement records. Like I said, two very heavy and angry albums, but I think Painkiller has to be the winner here, especially with absolute metal essentials like the title track, Hell Patrol, All Guns Blazing, Metal Meltdown, Between the Hammer and the Anvil, A Touch of Evil, and One Shot at Glory. Next, we have two flawless records here by Mercyful Fate with Melissa versus Don't Break the Oath. Great matchup here of debut versus sophomore record, and Personally, my favorite Mercy record has got to be In the Shadows from 1993, but these two battle it out all the time for my second and third favorite to round out the top three in their catalog. And, when Melissa came out at that time, nobody looked or sounded like Mercyful Fate, with King Diamond on lead vocals with those high and far falsettos, the guitar duo of Hank Sherman and Michael Denner, Timmy Hansen on bass, and Kim Rutz on drums. And it's the same lineup for Don't Break the Oath. Epic vocals and soloing on each, two crucial records, two extreme and black metal especially. And on Melissa, you have classics here like, of course, Evil, Curse of the Pharaohs, Into the Coven, Black Funeral, and the title track to close things out. And Don't Break the Oath holds its own as well, very evenly matched with standouts like A Dangerous Meeting, Nightmare, Night of the Unborn, The Oath, Gypsy, Come to the Sabbath as well. Great songs on both records here. And Melissa is really the perfect debut album for Mercyful Fate. It provided the groundwork for the band to get a bit more progressive, I think, on Don't Break the Oath, which is very cool. And, Don't Break the Oath also has a better production, in my opinion, and it's a toss-up here between these two, but I'm going to say Don't Break the Oath just slightly by a hair here. I think the production is better, like I said, and a little bit more experimental and progressive compared to the debut album. It's the David Lee Roth era of Van Halen versus Van Hagar up next here with 1984 versus 5150. Of course, 1984, the final album to feature David Lee Roth on lead vocals until 2012's Different Kind of Truth. And the album's successor, 5150, marked the Van Halen debut of former Montrose vocalist Sammy Hagar on lead vocals. And 1984 saw the band begin to take a much more synth-driven sound, incorporating synths more and more into their, sound and their approach here on that record, as heard more specifically on Jump, but it's prominent throughout the entire record, with standouts here like Panama, Top Jimmy, Drop Dead Legs, I'll Wait, Girl Gone Bad, and House of Pain. The only song I really don't like is Hot for Teacher, unpopular opinion, but I could never stand it. 1984 doesn't have as hard of an edge as the previous work up to that point, but it's full of great songs, and the band will continue to, pursue a more synth-driven commercial sound with 5150, incorporating more ballads into that record as well. Very 80s record here, and that along with the synths made, some feel like the band wasn't moving in as heavy a direction as they were in the past, but there's some great guitar tracks on here as well. The band also opted not to work with Ted Templeman on 5150, who instead worked with David Lee Roth on Eat 'Em and Smile around the same time period, and the sound on 5150 can best be described as very 80s, but also super vibrant, I think, and colorful. I'd say Van Hagar versus the David Lee Roth era is really a tale of two different bands, kind of like what I was talking about with Dio joining Black Sabbath and replacing Ozzy. Bringing in Sammy Hagar allowed Van Halen to do more in the studio because they weren't so confined by David Lee Roth's limited and more one-dimensional vocals, and Van Hagar is my personal favorite era of Van Halen. I know that might be an unpopular opinion too, and even though I love the David Lee Roth stuff as well, I've always been more of a Sammy Hagar guy over David Lee Roth, and for me personally, 5150 happens to be my favorite Van Halen record of all time. I'd even put it higher than the debut. Another unpopular opinion. I'm full of unpopular Van Halen opinions, I guess, but for me personally, this is the ultimate VH record, and I love Van Hagar. So this one, even though both records are phenomenal and they're both popular for different reasons and prominent in their catalog for different reasons, I got to go with 5150 over 1984 and the debut of Sammy Hagar with VH. This next one is like next to impossible. We have Led Zeppelin 2 versus Led Zeppelin 4. I don't even know where to begin here. I mean, the first four Zeppelin albums are so close together in quality that I don't know how I can fairly choose. Led Zeppelin 2 is the heavier record, right? It's a little more raw and less polished, and like their debut, is another crucial album to the early years of heavy metal, but also quite bluesy as well, and it features some of Jimmy Page's best work on that album, some classic riffs and solos, and standouts on this album, like Whole Lotta Love, What Is and What Should Never Be, The Lemon Song, Heartbreaker, Livin' Lovin' Maid, Ramble On, Bring It On Home, and on the other hand, you have Led Zeppelin 4, which is like the perfect Led Zeppelin album here. If you built a perfect Zeppelin record, you would get Zeppelin 4, and it's full of great tracks like Black Dog, Rock and Roll. Of course, you have Stairway as well, considered by many to be the greatest rock song of all time. For me personally, I prefer other tracks on this record, like Going to California or When the Levee Breaks, but some great songs on both of these albums, two absolute rock essentials, and even with Moby Dick on Zeppelin 2, I think John Bonham has a stronger performance on Zeppelin 4, and, truthfully, you really can't go wrong with either of these two records here. Ask me next week, and it might be totally flipped, but for me personally today, I'm going to go with Zeppelin 4. Not as consistent, I think, as Zeppelin 2, however, it has more variety to it, and the band really started to expand out their sound, which is really interesting to me, so for that reason, I love the variety on Zeppelin 4. Got to give it the slight advantage today. Let's do some prog here next with Yes, two classic albums from them. Gonna go with Relayer versus Close to the Edge. Both of these records are such incredible listens, really from beginning to end, and need to be listened to in order, like, one respective piece. Close to the Edge is probably the more marquee release here, right? I mean, I love all of side one's title track, and then side two you have And You and I, and of course Siberian Kotru. Relayer also has 3 tracks, quality over quantity, with classics like Gates of Delirium, Sound Chaser, and To Be Over. These are 2 essential prog listens, and the Yes catalog would be incomplete without either of them. I think Gates of Delirium is some of the best work Steve Howe ever did, but every note on Close to the Edge is perfect in my opinion, and Gates is probably my pick for the best Yes song of all time, but I think Close to the Edge is just a better album altogether. I think it was so ahead of its time, and even now, all these years later, so easy to get lost in. So for me, gonna have to give the advantage here to Close to the Edge and give this one the nod today. How about Grace Under Pressure versus Signals by Rush? 2 crucial records to the synth rock era of Rush, and they really doubled down on their synth usage, starting with Signals, and I'm sure that was a bit of a jolt at the time, but I think history has been very kind to this era of the band, and both records have aged super well. The band were definitely still in the process of, feeling out their new synth-driven sound on Signals, so they were more confident and refined with it on Grace Under Pressure, with standouts like After Image, Early Distant Warning, The Enemy Within, and Between the Wheels, but I've got to go with Signals here for this one. Even though Alex Lifeson's guitar wasn't as prominent in this era, I love the smoother mix on Signals, produced for the last time by Terry Brown, and not to mention, I think the record has higher highs and more memorable tracks with standouts on here like Subdivisions, The Analog Kid, Chemistry, Digital Man, The Weapon, New World Man, and Countdown to close things out. I love both albums, but I just find Signals to be the easier and more fun listen of the 2. Love this next one here. Let's go with Self-Titled, the debut by Blue Murder versus the debut by Badlands, also self-titled. It's a battle of 2 great guitarists here, as John Sykes' Blue Murder takes on Jake E. Lee's Badlands. And John Sykes coming off the success of Whitesnake 87, and Jake E. Lee, who just worked with Ozzy for several years. Badlands was a great debut album. They made 3 records, but I don't think they ever topped it. This was a great supergroup comprised, of course, of Jake E. Lee teaming up with Ray Gillen and Eric Singer, who previously worked together with Black Sabbath. Blue Murder was, a very underrated project by the late John Sykes, and their debut record really was, I'd say, the true follow-up to Whitesnake 87, working with Carmine Appice and Tony Franklin, and, both that bands should have been a lot bigger, in my opinion, but they kind of got lost in the shuffle by the time the 90s came around. Badlands, I think, were a decade too late. I mean, if their debut came out in the 70s with that blues rock sound, they would have been much bigger, and Blue Murder should have been bigger, too. I think John Sykes, in general, was criminally underappreciated, and I think, this one comes down to my preference of Jake E. Lee versus John Sykes. Jake E. Lee's riffs on Badlands are ferocious, but John Sykes is just such a fun player to listen to. Lots of great melodies in his playing as well, so ultimately I'm just a bigger John Sykes guy than I am a fan of Jake E. Lee, but they're both great players, so I'm just going to give this one to Blue Murder, but it's pretty close. Last matchup here, I'm going to go with Newfound Power by Damageplan versus A Lethal Dose of American Hatred by Superjoint Ritual. Great matchup here, 2 fantastic post-Pantera records, and of course, Damageplan was the project of Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul, following Pantera, and Superjoint Ritual was fronted by Phil Anselmo. Phil was pretty much at rock bottom around the recording of A Lethal Dose of American Hatred. This is an album that's super angry and aggressive. Not as good as the debut, in my opinion. Pretty rough around the edges. The band were pretty much recording in a drugged-out haze around this time period, and definitely not as polished as what the Abbott Brothers were doing with Damageplan and Newfound Power, which had a great groove to it. The band were experimenting a little bit with new metal as well, which is cool. So I'm going to give this one to Newfound Power. I think it's an all-around more focused record with some excellent riffage by Dimebag, who passed away less than a year after the album's release, and it would have been really interesting to have heard the evolution of Damageplan's sound and, the full vision the Abbott Brothers had for the band, where they would have gone next had Dimebag lived. Certainly leaves a lot to be desired. So that wraps up Album Wars Part 2, continuing to choose between album versus album matchups as selected by you guys. Thank you all for nominating these matchups. Again, I was not able to get to everybody, but if you're interested in it, I'd love to do a Part 3 and kind of make this a series on the channel, so there's still plenty more album versus album matches out there that I have not gotten to yet, so I'd love to do more of these in the future, so please let me know down in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know in the comments section below what are your thoughts on my picks, and how would you choose between these records. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.